I found this ring years ago, but not this one exactly. I mean, this one, yeah, I found it on the grass some time ago, but the real one, the Tolkien's ring, I found about 6 or 7 years back. Not the real ring, but the ideas behind its story. That was the first time I started reading his letters, his essays, and I started to watch interviews with him. And slowly, over time, I started to build my own world from what I've learned. And this video is about the 4 biggest things I've learned from Tolkien as a writer and as a world builder. Tolkien always said that the foundation of his stories and his worlds were his languages. In his letters, he explains that, quote, "The invention of languages is the foundation. The quote-unquote stories were made rather to provide a world for the languages than the reverse," end quote, letter 165. And, quote, "Many children make up or begin to make up imaginary languages. I have been at it since I could write," end quote, letter 131. Of course, just like any general advice, I didn't take it literally. Just because languages were the bedrock of Tolkien's world, that does not mean that any other fantasy world cannot be good if you do not start with languages. Of course, that's absurd. Tolkien was passionate about languages. He was a philologist and a linguist, and he knew about 30 languages. He was proficient in around a dozen of them, and he studied many of them academically. He invented Quenya and Sindarin for his books, and he's often paraphrased as saying, quote, "Philology is the foundation of all my work. It's not a hobby or a side interest. It's the soil out of which Middle-earth grew," end quote. And so I ask myself, if languages were the soil that Tolkien's world and stories grew, what is my soil? For me, it wasn't languages, it was history. History of warfare, geopolitics, and political intrigues. There is this idea and ethic in history that your job is not to judge the past. Your job is to understand it in the context of what was happening at the time. And that is how I started to build my own world and my own factions. What is very interesting is that your quote-unquote soil doesn't lock you up to a one particular type of story. Tolkien's soil was languages. But if you read any of his books, you know that none of his stories are about languages. His stories are about adventure, friendship, sacrifice, loss, and hope. The languages for him were just the birthplace of his stories. They were not what the stories were about. So if you're starting to write or build your own world, ask yourself this. What is your soil? What are you so obsessed about, so passionate about, that you can build an entire fictional world out of it? Whatever it is, let that thing guide you, not box you in. Because the soil feeds the plant, but it doesn't control how it grows. In his essay on fairy stories, Tolkien argued that a successful fantasy world required its author to create a secondary world that needs secondary beliefs. What he meant by this is that your world needs a set of very concrete rules for all those fantastical stuff happening inside. It needs to be, dare I say, realistic. Not realistic within our primary world, as Tolkien calls it, but realistic within itself, within this secondary world that you created. He put it like this, quote, "The moment disbelief arises, the spell is broken, the magic, or rather art, has failed. You are then out in the primary world again, looking at the little abortive secondary world from outside," end quote. When you experience stories, you have what is called the suspension of disbelief. Deep down, you know that this world that you are reading about does not actually exist. But at the moment when you are reading it, you believe it to be true. That is why you can feel emotional connection to fictional characters that you know they are not real. The same goes with movies. If you watch a scene in a movie, you know that those people are actors playing a scene. And then the production team puts some animations and special effects. Yet, if the movie is good, you're immersed in it. You don't think about all those things because you suspended your disbelief. And that is the fundamental rule that completely changed how I started to write my stories. Because if something doesn't make any sense within the rules of this fictional world that you created, As Tolkien said, the spell is broken. Whatever meaningful message you wanted to portray with your story, whatever depth your story had, it's no longer valid because the world will feel fake, because anything can happen, so the world doesn't really feel immersive. So ask yourself this: have you built a world that feel real? Does the rules that your world have make sense to you or to your audience? Would a reader that reads your book, your story, feel the spell broken? Consistent, believable worlds is always the skeleton of great stories. Tolkien often spoke about imagination as a garden, not a blueprint, and he often compared writing a story to growing a plant or caring for a garden. In his essay he wrote, quote, "One writes such a story not out of the leaves of trees still to be observed, nor by means of botany and soil science, but it grows like a seed in the dark out of the leaf mold of the mind, out of all that has been seen or thought or read, that has long ago been forgotten, descending into the deeps." End quote. What he meant by that is that good stories very often come from places we don't fully understand, from memories, from impressions and feelings that are buried deep inside of us, and not from carefully outlined and very precise blueprints, because writing is an art, not a scientific field. Even in the prologue of The Lord of the Rings, he wrote, quote, "This tale grew in the telling." End quote. When Tolkien first started writing The Lord of the Rings, he didn't actually know how it would end. He discovered the story as he wrote it, and that is exactly the strength of this type of writing, that each scene is like a branch that is growing out of the previous branch. You just need to ask yourself this: what happens next? And organically put this scene together. If something dramatic happens to a character, you can ask yourself, how would they react based on who they are? And then ask yourself, how will the world or the other characters around respond to that behavior? And just like that, the story grows like a plant. So don't be afraid to discover your story as you go. Build your foundation and plant your seed. Let it grow, let it surprise you. And sometimes, just like with plants in a garden, you just need to slightly guide it in a direction that you would like it to grow, but you shouldn't be upset if it grows in its own direction. One of the most disliked things in writing that Tolkien very often commented on is allegory. I swear, every single time I was reading an interview with him or watching an interview with Tolkien, without fail, he would always mention how much he disliked allegory. Even in his foreword to The Lord of the Rings, he said, quote, "I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations, and always have done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence." End quote. The reason why he disliked it so much was because he believed that allegory is an, quote, "deliberate domination of the author's meaning over the reader's interpretation." End quote. Letter 109. He often called allegory an authorial control over how the reader experienced the story, and that it's taking away the freedom of self-interpretation, basically removing art from the story and forcing an arbitrary message, almost like a form of propaganda by the author. In addition, this also makes the story age very, very badly, because usually allegory is about something that is happening at the moment of writing the story. And so if 50, 100 years passes, most people will not really understand what was the context of that allegory. And after that time, it will make that allegory, meaningless. What he proposed, on the other hand, was applicability. He always wanted people to interact with his stories through application. The difference is that application is allowing the reader to make up its own meaning from certain events or themes in the story. The One Ring is a perfect example of that. Till this day, many people have a multitude of interpretation what the One Ring in The Lord of the Rings represent. At the time of the release of the books, some people thought that this is an allegory for nuclear weapons. Others thought that this is a symbol for addiction or obsession or absolute power. And none of these things are wrong or correct, because the One Ring was never an allegory to anything. Tolkien never outright stated what the One Ring must represent. That was left up to you, the reader. That is applicability in storytelling. So here's the lesson I took from that as a writer. Don't write stories to lecture people. Instead, create a world full of meaning and trust your readers to find their own truth in it. The biggest thing I learned from Tolkien, honestly, is that I understand why he always compared writing to growing a plant. The first rule is the soil that you plant your seed of creation into. The seed of creation, the soil, is your passion that the story will grow from. The second rule are the roots of the plant. You need consistent rule sets for your world, because without those rule sets, it's like having a plant or a tree without the roots. With a gentle breeze, it will just collapse. Third rule is about guiding its growth and writing with a natural flow. You cannot really predict fully how the plant will grow. It can go anyways, but you can provide sun and shelter, and you can put some additional accessories, like here for example, to allow the plant to go the way you want it to go. And the last rule about allegory is like a weed that attaches itself to the plant and strangle it and feed upon it. And if you will not remove it in time, well, it will destroy the plant. And that will be all. If you liked this video, like, subscribe, comment, and do all the good YouTube things. And if you want more specific world building guides or writing guides, you can check this playlist here. But that is all for today, and, well, see you when I see you.